Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are going to talk about what I read in January. It was a marvelous start to the reading year. It really was. I read one book, but it was a fantastic book, and it was just what I needed to just put me in a really fantastic reading mood and just really get me started. And it was perfect, absolutely perfect. And that book is Vingt Apres, or 20 Years After, by Alexandre Dumas, which is the second book in the D'Artagnan romance series, which, if D'Artagnan rings a bell, it's from the Three Musketeers series, basically. So it's a little unfortunate that I'm introducing to you guys the second book of the series, because, as supposedly a booktube influencer, it would have been really great to have been able to introduce you from the very first book of the series. But unfortunately, I've already read that book, and I've actually already read the third book in the series, and I read that way before booktube. But basically, this is part of the D'Artagnan series. So the D'Artagnan series, very famous. Alexandre Dumas, takes place in the 1600s, where you have the Three Musketeers, Aramis, Porthos, Athos, who encounter D'Artagnan, who is trying to become a musketeer, and it follows their adventures. And then there are two more books in the series. So you have the original book, The Three Musketeers. Then you have this one, 20 Years After. And then there's a third volume called, in French, Le Vicomte de Bragelonne, or The Vicomte of Bragelonne, which in English translations, the third volume in the original French is actually typically broken down into three books, where the first one is Le Vicomte de Bragelonne, so the Vicomte de Bragelonne. The second one is Louise de la Vallière, or just another character's name. And then the third book is the very famous, and probably one of the most famous Three Musketeer stories, which is The Man in the Iron Mask. Famous because that's a section of the adventures that is very often turned into a movie, especially famous when it's starred by Leonardo DiCaprio in the American world. So it's a very long series, and again, I've already read the first series, and I've read the third, and I've already read the first volume, and I've read the third volume. Why did I read the third volume before I read the second volume? Well, that's because when I was in France for the summer, and I purchased the very last volume of the series, which is actually, in French, it's one volume, but it's such a big book. It's 2,700 pages, which is actually why they split it up in English translation, but it's 2,700 pages. So it's actually like 3 individual volumes within the one part of the series. So kind of confusing, but I remember that I was spending the summer in France, and I had purchased the third part of the series. And it was tempting so much. I was like, I can't wait until I'm back into the US to start this book. And so I ended up reading the third book, or the third part of the series, before I ever read the second part. So, they technically, in that sense, you could say they can be read out of order. Although obviously the third book is the conclusion to the entire series, so maybe you don't. But for me, it wasn't an issue. It was just as fun reading this out of order as it was reading it in order. But as you can see, it's quite a long book. All the books are very long. The first one, probably kind of like this one, in the 950 page range. And then that third part is, yeah, like I said, 2,700 pages in the original French. So it's a very long series, but it is so easy to read. It is pure adventure, but filled with a wit and a humor, and just, there's nothing that feels extraneous, or there's nothing that feels like it could be cut out or edited out. It just all makes sense, and it all has its place, and every little part of the book is referred to again later in the book. So there's nothing like, there might be something like, well, why are they talking about this? It will come back and it will be mentioned. So everything has its place. So there's not a single word that is unnecessary in this book. And it is so easy to read. Obviously, this is considered a French classic, but when it comes to classic and that sort of image that a lot of people create in their minds of like classics being very difficult to read and being very philosophical and being very literary, this is not that. This is just pure adventure. This particular volume in the 20 years later is, well, exactly what it says. It happens 20 years later after the plot of the very first book, where D'Artagnan first meets the Three Musketeers and they go on their adventure with the Cardinal Richelieu and having to give a favor to the Queen, and they have this enemy called Milady, and it's just their interaction with all of these characters. And then this book takes place 20 years after what happens in the first book. And basically we have a new cardinal. We have an Italian cardinal, Mazarin, who is now in place in France. You still have the Queen and of Austria, and basically you just see the four friends reunite. However, this time they're on opposing sides, so technically they've become enemies. So you have D'Artagnan and Porthos, who are against Aramis and Athos, when it comes to this moment in France where people were sort of starting to revolt against the government, and they really didn't like the cardinal. They wanted to separate the cardinal from the royalty, from the kings and queens, and it was just a very troublesome part of history. And now our friends are right in the middle of that, and they're on different parts in terms of allegiance. So we have all of this, and then we have another character, a new villain, come in, who is basically the ghost of Milady, our villain from the very first story. So it's all this huge adventure where each side is scheming and planning and doing what they're doing to support their side. But the question is, can they still be friends after all of this tension? So that's a part of this one, and it was so fantastic. It's just one of those books where you're smiling the entire time, you're having fun the entire time. You can't wait to turn the page. You can't wait to go home and read more pages. That's how I felt. I was reading this at lunch. I was reading this as a PDF so I could keep reading it on my computer. I was also reading it on my phone so I could read it while I was on the train, and then I also had the physical books that I could read when I was at home. I was 24 hours thinking and reading this book, and it was absolutely fantastic. I'm so happy to have finally finished this series. But seriously, reading this book just makes me want to start it all over again so I can revisit these amazing characters and just their fun personalities, because they're just so unique and so different. You have Porthos, who's the heavy, strong arm guy. You have D'Artagnan, who's kind of the catch-all. You have the Athos, who's kind of like the suspicious one of the group, who always has something. He's always looking for like the negative side, or not even so much the negative side, but he's always looking for like what could go wrong and things like that. So each one have their their strong individual personalities, but it all comes together to create this great foursome that are here to battle the people who are in the way of the king, basically. So it's absolutely fantastic. And again, like, having finished this book just makes me want to reread the series all over again, because it's such a fun time. It's amazing. So definitely read that. Now, there is something I wanted to warn you guys about reading this book in English. So I've already mentioned the fact that of how the books are divided in English. So make sure you are reading the right volume at the right time, in the right order. If you're not weird like me and read the books out of order. But yeah, so if in English, typically it's presented, the entire series is presented in 5 books. You have the Three Musketeers, followed by the 20 years later, and then typically the last part is separated. The Vicomte de Bragelonne, followed by Louise de la Vallière, followed by The Man in the Iron Mask. So that's the order you want to look in for these books. Now, I wanted to mention that when I was reading this book, there were 2 passages where I was very curious about how they would translate that into English, because I like to see, how is this, if there's like a fun play of words in like French, I love to see like, oh, how do they do this in English? It's just so fascinating for me. And when I went to go check up those passages on the English copy of 20 years later on Project Gutenberg, which is this wonderful service online that provides you a lot of these classics for free. You can just download them. They're free because there's no copyright on them anymore. The copyright is expired, so they're allowed to provide this for you for free. So it's a really great service. However, when it comes to this book, when I went to go check those passages, they weren't even there. They were cut out, the passages I wanted to look up. They were cut out. And then there was another part where I was kind of scrolling, and then I noticed something I had just read, and I'm like, well, that's different than what I just read. So I checked that. Again, there was a mistranslation. Then by curiosity, I chose just a random passage that was slightly more descriptive, at least because it was describing like the turmoil that was going on in Paris while our characters had been in England. And I decided to just check that just to see. And on the Project Gutenberg, again, a lot of sentences, a lot of paragraphs were cut out. Now, the Project Gutenberg document does not mention which edition they use, and they do not mention who the translator is, but it's very important to note. It's very important to say that when it comes to English translations of French works, the French classics, or your Zola, your Dumas, your Victor Hugo, your Jules Verne, etc., it's very important to know that a lot of the English translations are actually quite old, and those translations were created in a part of society where society was a lot more conservative. So a lot of old French classics are heavily edited. I know with the very first book of The Three Musketeers, his scenes with a certain female character in the book were heavily edited down to sort of not alleviate, but to push down, or to sort of dull like maybe something that might have like a slight sexual innuendo or things like that. So they made the books more conservative than they are, which these books are not exactly like they're not exactly like, you know, full of sexual scenes. Like there's this is an adventure book. It's men going on an adventure, sword fighting evil, good versus bad guys, etc., etc. There's not really a lot of romance and things like that. But even so, editors back in the day still found things that they thought needed to be cut out, deleted, removed, for the sake of more conservative readers at the time. So it's very important to know that if you're planning to read these books in English, check your translation, check your edition, and go for a modern translation. I mean, especially works like Zola. Zola was really, really edited, like seriously edited. And a lot of his works and other French authors haven't had an update in their English translations for a very long time. So just keep that in mind, that if you're reading this in English, be ready that your books are going to very likely be not super faithful to the original. And this isn't even limited to English. I was talking to one woman online who is where did she say she was from? It's not Belgium, because Belgium speaks French. Bulgarian. It was Bulgarian. And she told me when she read these works in the Bulgarian editions way back when, and she's older than me, so the translations are particularly even more older. But she mentioned that they are very, very heavily edited as well in like languages like Bulgarian. So yeah, I highly, highly recommend you reading these books. Dumas is fantastic. The Perfect Adventure. This is really the type of book that when people say they read for entertainment, this is what it is. Like, you're reading for entertainment here. There's no criticism on like the social circles of the day. There's no social commentary. There's no there are no politics. It's just pure adventure, and it's fun and it's relaxing. And if you're in a reading slump, like, this is what you want to pick up, because this will make you want to keep reading, and it'll make you want to read everything in the world immediately, because it's just that much fun. But again, just keep in mind, if you are reading these into translation, do check what edition you're reading to make sure that you're reading the least abridged, the least edited, and the most modern edition possible. So yeah, that's what I read in January. I was seriously obsessed with this, so happy to read this every single day. It was just the biggest joy, and it was the perfect start to my reading year. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!